back!
I'm 68 years old now, and for 4 decades I've been hiding something in the basement pool of my coastal Maine home that the government has been searching for since World War II. Her name is Marina, and she's a mermaid. What the Navy finally did when they found her changed everything I thought I knew about protection and captivity. My name is Dr. Robert Henley. I was a marine biologist before all this happened, specializing in cetacean communication at the University of Maine's Darling Marine Center. I published papers on dolphin acoustics, advised fishing companies on bycatch reduction, consulted for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I had a career, a reputation, colleagues who respected my work. That person doesn't exist anymore. The man I became instead spent 40 years maintaining a lie so enormous that some days I forgot what truth felt like. People ask why I'm coming forward now. The answer is simple. The Navy already knows. They found her 3 months ago, on March 15, 2024, and what happened after that makes keeping silent pointless. But more than that, I need someone to understand the choice I made back in 1984, and whether it was protection or imprisonment. I've spent 40 years telling myself I saved her life. Now I'm not sure. This is my story, and I need to tell it exactly as it happened, because the truth about what lives in our oceans is far stranger than anything you've imagined. September 11th, 1984. Hurricane Diana was bearing down on the Maine coast with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour. I was 28 years old, living alone in my grandfather's house on a rocky point outside Boothbay Harbor. The house sat on 4 acres of granite ledge and scrub pine, isolated enough that my nearest neighbor was half a mile down the coastal road. I'd inherited the property 6 months earlier when my grandfather died. He'd been a ship captain, spent 50 years working freight routes between Portland and Nova Scotia before retiring to that drafty Victorian house with its widow's walk and saltwater pool. The pool was his eccentricity, built into the basement in 1952 using an old ship's engineer and a lot of questionable ideas about plumbing. It was fed by underground channels he'd blasted through the bedrock, connecting directly to the tidal pools behind the property. The water cycled naturally with the tides, staying cold and clean without pumps or chemicals. I'd been using it for my own research. I had permission from the university to keep a small observation station at the house, monitoring marine mammal activity along the coast. I'd installed hydrophones in the water, recording equipment in what used to be my grandfather's study. It was perfect for someone who preferred solitude and didn't mind the isolation. The hurricane hit around 9 p.m. I'd spent the afternoon boarding windows and moving anything loose into the barn. The power went out at 8:30, and I sat in the kitchen with my battery-powered radio, listening to weather reports and eating cold soup straight from the can. The wind sounded like freight trains passing directly overhead. I could hear trees snapping in the woods behind the house. Around midnight, the eye passed over. The wind died completely, and the silence was startling after hours of constant noise. I knew I had maybe 40 minutes before the backside of the storm hit, so I pulled on my rain gear and went outside to check for damage. The destruction was extensive. Shingles torn off the barn roof, 2 pine trees down across the driveway, the dock behind the house reduced to splinters. I walked down to the tidal pools with my flashlight, checking the channels that fed the basement pool. That's when I heard it, a sound I'd never heard before. Not quite singing, not quite clicking, something between a dolphin's whistle and a human voice, but with harmonics that made my teeth ache. It was coming from the largest tidal pool about 50 yards from the house. I climbed down the rocks, moving carefully on wet granite. The flashlight beam caught something in the water. At first I thought it was a seal tangled in fishing line. Then I got closer. She was trapped in a massive commercial fishing net, the heavy gauge stuff used for dragging. The net was wound around her upper body and caught on the rocks. She was trying to pull herself toward deeper water, but the tide was going out, and she didn't have the strength. I saw the tail first. A horizontal fluke like a cetacean but scaled. Dark blue-green scales that caught my flashlight beam and reflected it back in iridescent patterns. The tail was maybe 4 feet long, powerful looking, bleeding from several deep cuts. Then I saw the rest of her. From the waist down, she was entirely fish. From the waist up, she was human. Not human-like. Human. A young woman's torso, arms, face. She had hair, dark and matted with blood and seawater. She had breasts. She had hands with fingers and opposable thumbs, though the fingers were webbed halfway to the first knuckle. She also had gills. I could see them clearly, 3 parallel slits on each side of her rib cage, fluttering as she struggled to breathe. My mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing, some kind of deformity, a genetic condition, a costume. But I was a marine biologist. I'd spent 10 years studying ocean mammals. I knew anatomy, I knew physiology, and I knew what I was looking at was impossible. She made that sound again, weaker this time. She was looking at me. Her eyes were large, slightly larger than human eyes, with nictitating membranes that slid across them when she blinked. The eyes were dark brown, almost black, and completely aware. She was dying. I could see it in the way she moved, the blood in the water, the ragged breathing through her gills. The net had cut deep into her flesh. One of the wounds looked like a propeller strike, 3 parallel gashes across her tail that had torn through scale and muscle. I had maybe 10 minutes before the backside of the hurricane hit. The water was already rising as the tide turned. If I left her here, she'd either drown when the storm surge hit or bleed out in the next hour. I pulled my diving knife from my belt and started cutting net. She didn't fight me. She watched as I worked, sawing through the heavy synthetic line. The net was tangled in at least 6 different places. Every time I cut one section free, I found another loop caught on her body or the rocks. My hands were shaking, partly from cold, partly from the impossibility of what I was doing. When I finally cut the last piece away, she tried to move toward the water. She got maybe 3 feet before collapsing. The propeller wounds were worse than I'd thought. She wasn't going to make it to deeper water on her own. The wind was picking up again. I could see the storm clouds moving back over the moon. I had maybe 5 minutes. I made a decision that would define the next 40 years of my life. I got my arms under her shoulders and started dragging her toward the house. She was heavy, probably 200 pounds, and the scales were slippery with blood and seawater. She made sounds I couldn't interpret, clicking and whistling, but she didn't resist. The basement entrance was around the back of the house. I'd left the door open for ventilation. I hauled her down the concrete steps, across the floor, and into the pool. She sank immediately, then surfaced a moment later. The pool was 12 feet deep, maybe 20 feet across, roughly circular. The water was seawater, cold and clean from the tidal channels. She swam to the far edge and held onto the concrete lip, breathing hard through both her mouth and her gills. I was soaking wet, exhausted, and beginning to comprehend what I'd just done. I'd brought a mermaid into my basement, a real, living mermaid. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. She looked at me across the water. I looked back. Then the power came back on. The basement lights flickered to life, and I got my first clear look at her in full light. She was young, maybe late teens or early 20s in human terms. Her face was human enough that she could have passed for a person from a distance, but the proportions were slightly off. The eyes too large, the nose too small, the mouth too wide. Her skin was pale gray-blue, lighter on her chest and stomach, darker on her back and arms. The scales on her tail started just below her navel, transitioning gradually from skin to scale over about 6 inches. The propeller wounds were bad, 3 deep cuts that had torn through the scales and into the muscle underneath. She was still bleeding, turning the pool water pink. I ran upstairs and grabbed my first aid kit, plus every clean towel I owned. I had no idea if human medical supplies would work on her, but it was all I had. When I came back down, she was still holding onto the edge of the pool, watching me. I knelt on the concrete and opened the kit. She didn't pull away when I reached for her. I cleaned the wounds with saline solution, applied antibiotic ointment, and bandaged them as well as I could with waterproof gauze. She made soft clicking sounds the whole time but stayed still. The gills were my biggest concern. They were inflamed, the tissue red and swollen. I'd seen similar infections in harbor seals. I used more antibiotic ointment, applying it carefully to the gill slits. She flinched but didn't pull away. When I finished, she pushed off from the edge and swam to the center of the pool. She dove under, stayed down for maybe 2 minutes, then surfaced and looked at me again. I sat on the concrete floor with my back against the wall. Outside, the hurricane was still raging. Inside, I was in a basement with a mermaid. I had no idea what to do next. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the basement floor with my grandfather's old wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching her. She spent most of the night at the bottom of the pool, surfacing every 10 or 15 minutes to breathe. The gills apparently weren't enough on their own. She needed air too. By dawn, the hurricane had passed. The house was still standing, though I could hear dripping water from somewhere in the walls and smell the wet wood odor of storm damage. None of that mattered. What mattered was the creature in my pool. I needed to make decisions. First, treatment. The wounds were serious enough that infection was a real risk. I'd used what I had in my first aid kit, but I needed proper medical supplies. Second, food. She was a living being and she'd need to eat. Third, secrecy. If anyone found out what I had in my basement, she'd end up in a government facility within hours. I went upstairs as the sun came up. The phone lines were down, which was normal after a hurricane. That gave me maybe a day before anyone checked on me. I made coffee on my camp stove and tried to think clearly. The rational thing would have been to call someone. The university, NOAA, maybe the Coast Guard, but I'd spent enough time around government agencies to know what would happen. She'd become a specimen, a research subject. They'd put her in a tank somewhere and spend the rest of her life studying her. Or worse. I'd heard rumors during my years working with marine mammal protection groups. Stories about military programs, experiments with dolphin cognition, attempts to weaponize marine animals. If the Navy found out about her, I had no idea what they'd do. I made a choice. I'd keep her hidden, at least until I understood what she needed and whether she could survive. I drove into Boothbay Harbor around 8 a.m. The roads were covered with debris but passable. The pharmacy was closed, but the veterinary clinic on the edge of town had power. I knew the vet, Dr. Patricia Morse, from my work with seal rehabilitation. I told her I'd found an injured harbor seal in the tidal pools and needed supplies. She gave me broad-spectrum antibiotics, wound care supplies, and a bottle of pain medication. She offered to come out and look at the seal, but I told her I'd already stabilized it and would bring it to the Marine Mammal Center in Portland once the roads cleared. I stopped at the fish market next. I bought 20 pounds of fresh mackerel, herring, and squid. The owner, Frank Tessier, didn't ask questions. Half the town kept seals or rescued seabirds in their bathtubs during storms. When I got back to the house, she was at the surface, holding onto the edge of the pool. She watched me come down the stairs with the bags. I needed to know if she could understand me. I sat on the edge of the pool and spoke slowly. "I'm Robert. I'm going to help you, but you need to stay here. Stay hidden. Do you understand?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then, deliberately, she nodded. My hands started shaking. I'd half convinced myself that the nod the previous night had been coincidence or misinterpretation, but this was clear, intentional. She understood English. "Can you speak?" I asked. She opened her mouth. The sound that came out was clicking, whistling, nothing like human speech. She tried again, and I could see the frustration on her face. Her vocal anatomy wasn't built for human language. "It's okay," I said. "We'll figure something else out." I spent the next hour changing her bandages. The wounds looked slightly better. The bleeding had stopped and the tissue didn't seem as inflamed. I gave her antibiotics, crushing the pills and mixing them with pieces of fish. She ate them without hesitation. Then I offered her the rest of the fish. She took a mackerel from my hand, bit into it, and ate it in 4 quick bites, bones and all. She ate 8 more fish before she stopped, Over the next week, I established a routine. I'd come down to the basement every morning at 6 a.m. before the sun was fully up. I'd change her bandages, give her medication, and feed her. She'd eat anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds of fish a day. I made trips to the fish market 3 times a week, rotating between the markets in Boothbay Harbor, Damariscotta, and Bath, so no one would notice the volume I was buying. The wounds were healing faster than I expected. By the end of the first week, the propeller cuts had closed over with new scar tissue. The scales around the injuries were growing back, though they were lighter in color than the surrounding area. We started communicating. I brought down a waterproof slate and marker, the kind divers use. I drew simple pictures: fish, water, sun, moon. She understood immediately. She took the marker and drew her own pictures. A school of fish, larger than any species I recognized, other figures with tails like hers, and something else, something that looked like a ship with nets. "Your family?" I pointed at the figures with tails. She nodded. "The ship separated you?" She nodded again. Then she drew more, multiple ships, some with different markings. One drawing showed a ship with what looked like sonar equipment. Another showed nets and lights. "They were hunting you." She made a sound I was beginning to recognize as agreement. A specific clicking pattern, 2 short and 1 long. I sat on the concrete and tried to process this. Commercial fishing operations, maybe military vessels, had been actively pursuing her and her pod. That explained the propeller injuries, the fishing nets. But it raised darker questions. How long had this been going on? How many others had been caught? "Are there more of you?" I asked. "More of your kind?" She drew a question mark. Then she drew waves, lots of them, and pointed up, indicating the ocean. "You don't know where they are." She shook her head. For the first time, I saw something like grief on her face. She was alone. Her family was gone, scattered or captured or dead, and she had no way to find them. I made a decision that night. I couldn't release her. Not yet. Even if her wounds healed completely, I had no way of knowing if her pod was still in the area, if she could survive on her own, or if the ships that had been hunting her were still out there. And if she ended up caught again, I wouldn't be there to cut her free. She would stay in the pool. I would keep her safe, keep her hidden, and figure out what to do next. I told myself it was temporary. A few months, maybe a year, until she was fully recovered and I could be sure she'd survive in the open ocean. That was 40 years ago. By October 1984, Marina, I'd started calling her that, though I had no idea if she had a name of her own, was fully healed. The propeller scars had faded to pale lines across her tail, barely visible unless you looked closely. She was eating regularly, swimming with strength and grace, and showing no signs of infection or illness. I should have released her. The rational part of my brain knew this. She was healthy, the weather was still relatively warm, and she could survive in the open ocean. But I didn't. I told myself I needed to monitor her longer, make sure the healing was complete, wait for better weather. The truth was simpler. I was afraid of what would happen to her out there. I'd spent the previous month researching everything I could find about marine mammal hunting, commercial fishing practices, and naval operations in the North Atlantic. What I found made releasing her seem like a death sentence. There were reports going back decades, unusual catches reported by fishing crews, then immediately classified by federal authorities. Sonar contacts that didn't match any known species, investigated by Navy vessels and never explained. And older stories, folklore really, about fishing boats that had caught something in their nets and been ordered to turn it over to military personnel. I found a declassified report from 1962 buried in a University of Maine archive. A fishing trawler operating off the coast of Newfoundland had reported catching a large marine mammal of unknown species in their nets. The Coast Guard had intercepted the vessel before it reached port. The catch was confiscated, the crew was debriefed by federal agents, and the entire incident was classified. The report had been declassified in 1982, but with heavy redactions. Only the basic facts remained. Whatever Marina was, The government had been looking for her kind for at least 20 years, maybe longer. I couldn't release her into that, so I kept her in the pool, and I told myself it was protection. We developed a more sophisticated communication system. The waterproof slate was useful but limited. I needed something better. I bought a set of large laminated cards and drew symbols on them. Dozens of different fish species, weather conditions, time indicators, emotional states. I added cards for family, danger, ship, net, all the concepts we'd been trying to communicate with crude drawings. Marina learned the system faster than I could create it. Within 2 weeks, she could string together complex ideas. She'd point to the card for family, then ship, then danger, then separate. I understood. Her pod had been attacked by ships, and she'd been separated from them in the chaos. I added more cards, numbers, directions, questions. She picked them up immediately. By November, we could have actual conversations. I'd ask her questions and she'd respond by selecting cards and arranging them in sequence. Sometimes she'd draw supplementary pictures to clarify meaning. I learned things about her I hadn't expected. She was intelligent, obviously, but the depth of that intelligence surprised me. She understood abstract concepts. She had a sense of humor, though it was strange and I didn't always get the joke. She was curious about everything in the basement: the pool filtration system, the concrete structure, the electrical lights. The lights especially fascinated her. She'd never seen artificial light before. I brought down a flashlight and let her play with it. She spent an hour clicking it on and off, watching the beam move through the water, creating patterns. Then she started experimenting, holding it at different angles, seeing how the light bent at the water's surface. She asked questions constantly. She'd point at objects and look at me expectantly, and I'd explain what they were. I brought down books with pictures, marine biology texts, oceanography references, even children's picture books for basic vocabulary. She absorbed everything. I started teaching her to read. I made cards with written words matching the symbols: fish, water, danger, family. She learned to recognize the words within days. By December, she was reading simple sentences. I brought down a portable chalkboard and set it up on the pool deck. I'd write questions and she'd write answers, her letters crude but readable. The process was slow. Her hands weren't built for writing. The webbing between her fingers made holding a pencil awkward, and she had to press hard to make marks the chalk would leave. But she persevered. By Christmas 1984, 3 months after I'd found her in the tidal pools, we were having written conversations. I asked her about her life before the ships. She wrote slowly, stopping to think between words. Deep water, cold. We traveled, followed fish. How many in your family? 12, mother, sisters, others. Do you think they survived? She didn't answer right away. She swam to the bottom of the pool and stayed there for several minutes. When she surfaced, she wrote a single word. No. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that her family might still be out there, but I couldn't lie to her. She'd seen what I'd seen, the ships, the nets, the hunting. She knew the odds. I asked her what she wanted. Did she want to try to find survivors? Did she want me to release her? She wrote, afraid, ships still there. I'll keep you safe, I said. You can stay here as long as you need. She looked at me with those large dark eyes. Then she wrote one more word. Prison? The question hit me harder than I expected. Was this a prison? I was keeping her in a basement pool, isolated from her natural environment, hidden from the world. I'd told myself it was protection, but what was the difference? No, I said, not a prison, a refuge. You're free to leave whenever you want. I'll help you. But I think it's safer here. She wrote, safe, but alone. I had no answer to that. Over the next few months, I tried to make the pool less isolating. I installed better lighting, brought down a radio so she could hear music and news broadcasts, added enrichment, toys, objects to manipulate, puzzles to solve. I spent hours in the basement every day, not just feeding her and checking her health, but talking to her, teaching her, learning from her. She taught me things about the ocean I'd never known. She drew maps of underwater currents, showed me feeding grounds I'd never heard of, explained migration patterns that didn't match any scientific literature. She knew things about marine mammal behavior that contradicted published research. I started keeping detailed notes. I told myself it was for her benefit, documenting her health and needs. But part of me knew I was conducting research. I was studying her, exactly what I'd been afraid the government would do. The difference, I told myself, was that she was a willing participant. She wanted to teach me. She wanted me to understand her world. And I never hurt her, never took samples without asking, never pushed her beyond what she was comfortable sharing. But I was still keeping her in a basement pool. And as winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, I began to realize that temporary was becoming permanent. I'd modified my entire life around her. I'd turned down a research position in California. I'd avoided relationships because I couldn't bring anyone to the house. I'd stopped having colleagues over, stopped attending conferences, gradually isolated myself from everyone who might ask too many questions. By the summer of 1985, my world had shrunk to the house, the pool, and marina. I told myself it was necessary. I was protecting her. But I was also protecting myself. From the guilt of releasing her, from the consequences of revealing her, from having to make any decision at all. Marina never complained. She seemed content in the pool. But sometimes I'd catch her floating at the surface, staring up at the basement ceiling, and I wondered what she was thinking. Did she miss the open ocean? Did she dream about her family? I never asked. I was afraid of the answer. By 1986, keeping Marina hidden had become the central fact of my existence. Every decision I made, every relationship I maintained, every aspect of my daily routine was built around maintaining the secret. I developed elaborate systems. The pool's filtration was connected to the tidal channels, so the water cycled naturally. But I added backup pumps and filters in case the channels got blocked. I installed a generator in the barn for power outages. I soundproofed the basement, adding layers of acoustic insulation to the walls and ceiling after a plumber came to fix a pipe and mentioned he could hear weird echoes from below. Marina's vocalizations were the biggest security risk. She couldn't help making sounds, clicks, whistles, songs. It was how her kind communicated. During the day, she stayed relatively quiet, but at night, especially during the full moon, she'd sing. The sound carried through the house, through the walls, into the night air. After the plumber incident, I became paranoid. I added more insulation. I installed a white noise generator in the basement that masked her sounds with recordings of ocean waves. I told neighbors I was running an aquaculture experiment for the university, keeping fish tanks that needed constant water circulation. That explained the pumps, the fish deliveries, the modifications to the house. My work at the university changed. I couldn't take positions that required me to be away from home for extended periods. I turned down a research cruise to study humpback whale migration in the Caribbean. I declined an invitation to join a project monitoring seal populations in Alaska. I focused instead on projects I could do from home: acoustic analysis, data processing, writing grant proposals for other researchers. My colleagues noticed. Dr. Sarah Chen, who ran the marine mammal program, asked me several times if I was okay. I told her I was dealing with family issues, which was technically true, though not in the way she understood. The isolation was difficult. I'd always been somewhat solitary, but this was different. I couldn't have friends over. I couldn't date. Anyone who got close enough to visit the house regularly would eventually hear something, notice something, ask questions I couldn't answer. I had one close call in 1987. A woman I'd met at a conference, another marine biologist named Dr. Rebecca Walsh, drove up from Boston to visit. We'd been corresponding for months, and the visit was supposed to be professional. She wanted to see my acoustic monitoring setup. But it turned into something else. We spent the evening talking about our research, our lives, our shared love of the ocean. When she suggested staying the night, I wanted to say yes. but Marina was in the basement. Marina, who sang at night. Marina, who I checked on every few hours. Marina, who would hear footsteps above her and might make sounds out of curiosity or concern. I told Rebecca I couldn't, that I had to be up early for equipment maintenance. She left disappointed, and we never spoke again beyond formal emails. I told myself it was necessary. Marina's safety depended on absolute secrecy. But late that night, sitting in the basement and watching Marina swim lazy circles in the pool, I wondered what I was giving up. The fish deliveries became a routine. I rotated between 4 different suppliers, never buying more than 15 pounds at a time from any single source. Marina ate between 50 and 70 pounds of fish per week. That meant 3 or 4 trips to different markets, plus supplemental purchases at grocery stores and bait shops. I kept detailed records of her diet, her health, her behavior. I weighed her regularly using a modified livestock scale, tracking her growth. When I found her in 1984, she weighed approximately 195 pounds. By 1988, she weighed 230 pounds. She was still growing, still maturing. I tried to provide enrichment. I brought down books, hundreds of them. Marina read voraciously. She started with children's books and basic texts, then moved to novels, history, science. Her reading comprehension was extraordinary. Within 3 years, she was reading at a college level. We had long conversations using the chalkboard. She'd read a book and wanted to discuss it. She had opinions, interpretations, questions about human culture that I'd never considered. She asked about human families, why we lived in small groups instead of pods. She asked about cities, having seen photographs in National Geographic magazines I'd brought down. She asked about war, having read a history of World War II. That conversation lasted for hours, and I had no good answers. She was particularly interested in marine biology, which made sense. I brought down my university texts, my research papers, published studies on cetacean behavior. She read everything, then drew corrections in the margins. Half of what scientists thought they knew about dolphin communication was wrong, according to her. She showed me why, explaining the nuances we'd missed. I started incorporating her insights into my own work, carefully, without attribution. I published a paper on dolphin acoustic patterns that included ideas she'd shown me. The paper was well received. I won a small research grant based on it. The irony wasn't lost on me. My career was improving because I was keeping a sentient being in my basement. By 1990, 6 years after I'd found her, Marina had become my closest companion. We spent hours together every day. I'd bring my meals down to the basement, eating on the pool deck while we talked. I'd read aloud to her. We'd watch television together. I'd installed a small TV on the wall so she could see it from the water. She loved nature documentaries, especially ones about the ocean. But she'd also become fascinated by human drama, soap operas and sitcoms. She'd laugh at jokes, get invested in characters, ask me to explain cultural references she didn't understand. She was adapting to captivity remarkably well, too well. That was the thing that troubled me most. She seemed happy, content. She never demanded to be released, never showed signs of depression or stress. She'd created a life in that pool, limited as it was. I told myself this proved I'd made the right choice. She was safe, healthy, intellectually stimulated. What more could she want? But sometimes I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and go down to the basement, and I'd find her floating at the surface, motionless except for the slow movement of her gills. And I'd wonder if she was sleeping or just waiting for something I couldn't give her, waiting for a life she'd never have again. The guilt grew worse as years passed. By 1995, she'd been in the pool for 11 years. 11 years since she'd felt ocean currents, seen natural light, tasted wild fish. 11 years in a concrete cylinder 20 feet across. I tried to rationalize it. She was alive. She would likely be dead if I'd released her. The ships were still out there. I'd seen reports of unusual sonar contacts, unexplained catches that were quickly confiscated by federal authorities. Whatever organization was hunting her kind hadn't stopped. But was survival enough? Was mere existence enough? I never asked her directly. I was afraid she'd say no, and then I'd have to make a choice I'd spent 11 years avoiding. Instead, I kept improving the pool. I installed underwater speakers so she could hear better sound quality. I added more lights, creating day-night cycles that mimicked natural rhythms. I brought down a laptop computer and taught her to use it, setting up a keyboard with modified keys she could press with her webbed fingers. She took to the computer immediately. Within weeks, she was typing, slowly but accurately. We could have text conversations now, no longer limited to the chalkboard. She could write longer thoughts, express more complex ideas. She started keeping a journal. I gave her access to a word processor, and she'd type for hours. I never read it without asking. It was private, her own thoughts in her own words. But sometimes she'd show me entries, things she wanted me to understand. One entry from 1996 stayed with me. Robert asks if I am happy. I do not know this word's meaning anymore. I am not in pain. I am not afraid. I have food and learning and someone who talks to me. But I remember the deep water. I remember swimming for days and feeling current change. I remember the taste of fish I caught myself. I remember mother's songs. Are these things happy? Or is this safe? I do not know. I printed that entry and kept it in my desk drawer upstairs. I'd read it when the guilt became too much, when I needed to remind myself why I couldn't keep doing this. But I never changed anything. Marina stayed in the pool, I stayed in the house, and the years kept passing.